Thanks for coming out for Kagan the Damned 2. It is a trilogy, so I'm working on the third one now, the Dragon in Winter. And how many of you have actually read the first one in the series? Okay, good. So there will be no spoil. If I accidentally say something, which I'm going to try not to do, at least there won't be spoilers. All right, I won't. I promise no spoilers then. But I'm having so much fun. And he mentioned Karl Albert Wagner. It's a shame his books are out of print. He's since passed. He is one of my all-time favorite fantasy writers because he went really dark with his stuff. The character in his books was not even the hero of the story. He's just less villainous than the other characters. And they're really fun books. It's weird that you mentioned that because I'm actually reading, rereading the whole Kane series right now. A buddy of mine who owns a bookstore up in Encinitas, Greg Mullen, gave me Death Angel's Shadow, which has my favorite werewolf story in it, and it's what inspired the werewolf Kagan story that's actually online. So, yeah, but yeah, Karl Wagner, my guy. So, real quick, how I got involved in writing fantasy, because I'm mostly known for my Joe Ledger thrillers, for horror novels, the Pine Deep series and so on, and for my Rotten Ruin books. A couple of years ago, an editor, the same editor for my Joe Ledger books, just called me out of the blue and said, we were at a meeting, here at the publishing house, and we wanted to have a bigger presence in the epic fantasy world. Do you ever read any of that stuff? And I said, first book I ever bought was Conan the Wanderer, so yes. And I've read all of these guys. And they said, well, would you pitch something? So I went. I was just leaving a restaurant when he called. I went back and sat down, had another cup of coffee, wrote a pitch, and 40 minutes later, we had the deal on the table for Kagan, which was crazy. And I wound up writing the first Kagan book, which is a pretty long book. This one's longer, but I wrote that in about 2.5 months. I just sat down and banged it out. I had so much fun with it. So many of the things that I wanted to write in fantasy, things that I wanted to read in fantasy. And that's often what happens with writers. We write the stuff that we want to read. And, because to a great degree, especially before our careers really get started, we are our own fan base. We're the ones who get to see the stuff. And I really had fun with it. And then the beginning of last year, I had to, they said, oh, we want to put this one out in, the first one out in May. So we want to put the next one out in January. I'm like, that's quick. And he said, how fast can you write it? And this is 217,000 words, and I wrote it in 91 days, while also writing 3 short stories. So clearly, if I'm that invested in it, I'm having fun. Some of my favorite characters that I've ever created are in there. We had a book discussion group online for Kagan last night, and one of the favorite characters is Jacob Ravensmere, the librarian. Everyone loves that character, and it was like I based him off my journalism professor, who I hated. So that's kind of interesting, I hated the guy, but he made me a better writer. So it's a love-hate sort of thing. But to give you an idea, in journalism school, I went to Temple University School of Journalism. On Friday, every Friday we come in, there would be 10 sheets of typing paper. This is back in those days, 1977. 10 sheets of paper, a typewriter, a topic on the board. He would start a 90-minute timer, and we would have to turn in a complete article. And he would put on a record of sound effects, babies crying, car crashes, explosions, and he'd crank it all the way up. So we had to write that, and we had no idea what the topic was going to be. So we had to figure something out. And we all hated him for it, but it's because of that I can write fast. So this year I'll be writing 4 novels and 20 short stories. I'm doing an experiment right now where I'm writing 2 novels at the same time. Just to see if I can do it, because, why not? I'm not completely insane, but I will be by the time I'm done. So there's a whole new series I'm doing. It's a brand new imprint called Weird Tales Presents. And I edit Weird Tales magazine. It's Weird Tales Presents. Now, H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and all those guys got their start in Weird Tales almost 100 years ago. So there's a bit of a heritage there. I'm doing it. You guys know who Cthulhu is? Okay. So I'm doing a science fiction novel where we're able to do a one-time trip to the other side of the galaxy. People volunteer. They know they're not coming back. But we go all the way over there, and we find out that creatures like Cthulhu and all of those types of monsters, those gigantic elder gods, came to Earth because they were afraid of what was out there. And we just announced our presence. So it's going to be fun to write. So I'm doing that in the morning, 2,000 words a day, and in the afternoon I'm doing 2,000 words a day on Dragon in Winter. And it is interesting shifting gears to go from one to the other. But as a writer, you want to make sure that there's nothing that you can't at least do or try. Everything that's come my way in my career, some of the weirdest things I've done. Where when somebody asked me if I would give it a shot, and I said yes, just for the heck of it. Like Marvel Comics called me up one day and just asked me out of the blue, do I want to write for Marvel? First off, that is the world's stupidest question. Do I want to write for Marvel? Let me think about that. Now, luckily, this was a phone call, because on the phone, I've got a really good business phone voice. Physically, I'm doing the Snoopy dance all over my office, which is not a real good look, so that was one. Another, when my agent had taken one of my short stories that I had written for an anthology and said, this could be a young adult novel. And I hadn't read young adult since To Kill a Mockingbird in the 7th grade. And she said, can you give me a pitch for this as a novel? So I pitched it. It became Rotten Ruin, which became a total of 7 novels. And now there's a film in development. I was telling Rob, I just got the script for the film a couple of weeks ago, and I'm doing the notes. It's weird. I'm being asked to give notes on the script, based on it's a little surreal. But a lot of that stuff, probably my favorite story about doing things outside my range, and this is certainly outside my range, or should be outside my range based on what I have written so far. I was asked to do a Wizard of Oz story, and wound up writing a story that the estate of L. Frank Baum reached out to me after the story was published and said that they liked it so much, they're adding it to the official chronology of Oz, and I cried buckets on that one. And now that almost the entire Wizard of Oz series is in the public domain, I just had a brief email exchange with Neil Gaiman about whether he would be willing to contribute to a story if I did an anthology of Wizard of Oz stories. So I think I'm going to get Neil Gaiman. I might probably get Joe Hill and a bunch of other folks to do Wizard of Oz stories. So I love my job. This is based on I love my job. But Son of the Poison Rose, one of the fun things about doing this type of epic fantasy is taking certain cliches of epic fantasy and kind of changing them. Like, Kagan is not the chosen one. He, in fact, is the least likely person to have been chosen. I mean, the first third of the first book, he's drunk and inconsolable, suffering from PTSD, and is literally damned by his own gods. So, not the chosen one. But he becomes the hero of his own story, and that's really an important thing for me when I'm writing. Is I want to take a character who shouldn't be the hero, or like Joe Ledger is so emotionally damaged, nobody should ever hire him, and yet he was the right guy for that job. So I like taking characters who are damaged or just not that sort of a person, and then putting them in the path of events so that they either get swept, away by them, or they have to level up and be the hero. And those are the fun stories I like. I did a couple of novels, Ink and Glimpse, so standalone novels, where I had female protagonists in both who, again, were certainly not my experience being a guy. But I dove into what their experience would be. I did lots of interviews and so on. And saw what it would take to get certain people of a certain, life experience to then stand up and be the person who's going to fight for themselves and others. And I find that sort of thing the most enjoyable to write. So Kagan, not the chosen one, but he rises to it. In the middle of Son of the Poison Rose, there's a scene that, for those who read my Joe Ledger books, I tend to write a pretty graphic fight scene. Actually, the first book in this series is pretty graphic. There's a fight scene in there that my audiobook reader, Ray Porter, called me and said, "Dude, what's wrong with you?" It's basically the point where Kagan really gets his stuff together. And unfortunately for the person he's fighting, that's the moment where Kagan gets his stuff together. So it was a little rough. But I had so much fun with this. There's a lot of for those who have an interest in poetry or folklore, there are a lot of elements of poetry and folklore built into the characters. The character of Marilena, for example, Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott, Keats' La Belle Dame sans Merci, Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Princess, Fairy Queen, rather. All of those elements are built into the Marilena character. And there's even going to be a scene in the next book, I'm just about to write the scene, that's technically a sequel to Keats's poem. If you ever read that poem, and it's a fun poem to read, it's a guy at night falls for this elf that he meets in the woods, and she lures him to her grotto or whatever, and he sees in the marshes there the bodies of dead kings and heroes and princes, and he realizes that he's the next one to be in that, and Marilena has that, and in the next book, those guys get their moment, so it's gonna be fun. One of the other things I like doing with this series, it's really hard to point at any character, even the Witch King, and say he is the bad guy, because he has a point. There is a reason for him doing what he's doing, and the Silver Empire, which were the good guys. And by the way, if you haven't read the book, the Silver Empire falls in the second chapter, so it's not like a spoiler there. But there is a reason for this guy to dislike that empire. And, the Hackians, as brutal as they are, have a point. It would be no different than if the Cherokee rose up and went to war with the people living in America. They would have a point, because it was their land, we killed them. So I like having that ambiguous right and wrong thing flavoring all the characters and all the relationships throughout the story. So I had a lot of fun writing this book. And by the way, if anybody has any questions here or online, feel free to either raise your hand here, or if you get one over there, let me know. Do you have one? Oh, okay.
All right, we have a few. Hello, I'm Disembodied Voice. All right, so our first question comes from Robin Marks. It says, "Hi, Jonathan. I just received the book. Who's your favorite character in these two books?"
It's kind of a cross between Mother Frey, because she's actually the first character in the Kagan world I created in a short story that I wrote years ago. Weirdly, it was an anthology of stories modeled after Sherlock Holmes. I will explain. Michael Ventrella and Michael Ventrella is a good friend of mine. We had done an anthology called Baker Street Irregulars, where we wanted to do stories where the model characters are the hyper-vigilant detective type and the person who is his assistant who always asks him questions. But we wanted to do versions of it, one of our writers to do versions of it that were anything except two middle-aged white guys. So there were anime characters and aliens and plenty of women characters. So that was fun. And Michael had asked that I write a story for it too, which editors usually don't write stories for their own anthologies, but Michael wanted that in there. So I wrote one about a woman who was chief investigator for the Office of Miracles and her assistant. And that's Mother Frey and Miri. And I wrote that story, The Hammer of God, probably 10 years ago. And when I was creating the Kagan world, I realized that story was one of two fantasy stories I'd written. Those stories were in the Kagan world. So she's one of my favorite characters for sure. My second favorite character is actually Took, partly because of his sense of humor, most of which is not printable. He has a unique way of cursing, which I have people who will send me emails just with one of Took's curses in it and nothing else. It's like, I assume that I should take that, in an upbeat way. But those are my two favorite characters. But really, writers love all their characters, and even the ones that are vile and you're supposed to hate them. I get into their heads, and when you get into a character's head, even though you may not agree with their worldview, you have to understand it in order to write them. So if I'm writing about Lord Nespar or Lady Kestrel or the Witch King or Jacob Ravensmere, they're the four bad guys. I have to be able to understand why they think they're right. And that's a difficult thing to do, because if you can't get inside your villain's head and understand why they feel they're right, the character is two-dimensional. It's going to have no life, no depth to it. And that's one of the reasons people love Hannibal Lecter so much. He was a vile guy. He was a mass murdering cannibal. But you can see his point at times. And he's so polite and he's so affable and intelligent that people liked him. And even at the end of that movie, when he's hunting the warden of the prison that he was in, he's going to catch him and kill him and eat him. And we're rooting for him. The guy was keeping a mass murderer, in check, in jail. Maybe an ass, but he was the good guy in that scenario, and yet we're rooting for Hannibal Lecter. So when you create a three-dimensional villain, they really come to life, and I love doing that sort of thing. It's what they did actually in the Star Wars novels than in the movies. They went deep into Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader's character, and gave him depth and complexity so that he wasn't just a bad guy. Even though he had that redemptive moment and so on, they gave him depth to it. You guys have any questions or topics? Anything you would like to talk about? Because you're here.
There is.
Oh yeah, sure. So, in fantasy, they always create pantheons of gods, and I knew from having written the two short stories I did before that I had created this pantheon of harvest gods, and that's kind of cool. I like the whole pantheon of harvest gods. That's my only completely original pantheon of gods in the series. The other three pantheons that are mentioned, you have Hastur. And a lot of people think that H.P. Lovecraft created Hastur. He did not. Robert W. Chambers did in a novel called The King in Yellow. And it was a really brilliant book that influenced, one of the strongest influences on H.P. Lovecraft was Robert Chambers' book. And also Cthulhu, which Lovecraft did create. But there are elements of the Cthulhu story that he borrowed from Lord Dunsany, from Chambers, even to a degree from Edgar Allan Poe, because Edgar Allan Poe wrote a novel, Henry Gordon Pym? Yeah, Arthur Gordon Pym. And the last part of it, he goes to the Antarctic, and in fact, that cry that most people associate with the Shoggoths in the Cthulhu, the Tekli, that's actually from Poe. Poe came up with that. And then Jules Verne wrote a sequel to it. And then later on, Lovecraft expanded it. And one of the things Lovecraft did that was so fascinating, he took, when he created his gods and the basic setups for them, the elder gods, the elder things, the Shoggoths and so on, he then invited all of his friends who were writers to use those characters. So you have some of them appearing in the Conan stories, because they were both writing for Weird Tales, and they were all correspondents. They were all writing to one another. Robert Bloch, the guy who later wrote Psycho, was one of the early writers of Lovecraftian type stories for Weird Tales. And since then, everyone has written Weird Tales, written Lovecraft stuff. Stephen King's The Mist is definitely a Lovecraft story, because it is those creatures coming through the mist. It's a Lovecraftian story. He did three, I think. He did one, Crouch End, and there was another one that he did, N, I think it was, about the guy who was OCD, and he was able to use his desire to impose his rigid normalcy on the world. I was able to keep the elder things in check. Neil Gaiman's written stuff. The Hellboy character, all of Hellboy is Lovecraftian. And little side note, the next issue of Weird Tales magazine that comes out has a Hellboy cover story written by Christopher Golden with cover art by Mike Mignola. So that's kind of fun. But a lot of people have written Lovecraftian stuff. He made it it's like the first open source stuff. And so since I'm editing Weird Tales and I love epic fantasy, and my two biggest influences were Robert E. Howard for Conan and Carl Wood Wagner for the Kane stories, both of which use Lovecraftian elements, I just wanted to play with that, that and also explore it and expand it a little bit. I think I'm the first person to make Cthulhu a kind of a good guy, though. not that he's a nice guy, but he is protecting his people. And his people invoke him to stop Hastur from taking over the world. So that surprised a lot of folks, and I had fun with that. And the third is Dagon, which is a water god that existed before Lovecraft, but Lovecraft did the Dagon story, and really made it that cult more famous. And I made them the water gods that the Therians pray to. So those three pantheons exist within that world, and we're gonna dig a little more deeply into the Lovecraft stuff, though, with Shoggoths and other creatures that they'll meet. Shoggoths are shape-shifting monsters, and Kagan will encounter one of those. Actually, there's a short story that's coming out in an anthology edited by Keith DeCandido, where it's a flashback story with Jekyll, Falker, and Harapath, his three older brothers, and he and Kagan. They go to a glacier and they encounter a Shoggoth. So I've been throwing that stuff in there, having some fun with that. So good question. What else we got? Yeah, we got one over there. I'll come back to Fred.
So you kind of mentioned this already, but I would be remiss if I didn't actually ask the question. This comes from Tony Pineda. Hi, I love this new series. I'm about halfway through the first book. Am I wrong to be hearing echoes of two of my favorite book series, Conan the Barbarian and Cthulhu Mythos?
Yes, they are the uncles of this book for sure. And I'm going to be continuing putting Lovecraftian elements in some of my fiction because I just think it's something that's fun to explore, and it also there are enough readers out there who either know it or have heard of it that it kind of creates a bit of familiarity. And when you put something in that's familiar in fiction, it kind of makes the fiction a little more grounded in reality because it's part of somebody's experience. And I do this with my Joe Ledger stuff too, because most of what happens in the Joe Ledger stuff is real. 90% of the weird stuff in those books is real stuff. The 10% is fiction. It's kind of hard to figure out where the fiction begins. And sometimes you make up stuff in your books and then it comes true. Like a lot of the robot stuff, a lot of the drone stuff, the pigeon drones and all that, which you're seeing in the news right now. I had those 10 years ago, and I had friends who were saying, "Oh, they're never going to miniaturize a drone enough." They're doing bee drones now, which have been in my books for years. They're doing bee drones, grasshopper drones, and AI, which is scary as hell. So, yeah, let's create robot bodies and give them the ability to think independently. Let's do that, and then we can call it Terminator. So, Fred, what do you got? Andy McDonald, without pause. My favorite mystery writer of all time. The Travis McGee mystery series is my favorite mystery series, even though it's a little dated now. I listen to those on audio almost every year, all 21 books. But in fact, they're the books that got me interested in audio. They were originally abridged, read by Darren McGavin. Awesome. But my buddy Robert Peckhoff does them now and does a great job. So he would be my first choice. Second choice, it's a tie between Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, big Sherlockian, and I would actually like to sit down and talk folklore with Bram Stoker. And just for fun, I've won a number of Bram Stoker awards. I'd love to have one on the table and say, guess what this is? His grandnephew, Dacre, is a buddy of mine. And he and I both wish we could have a conversation with Bram Stoker. We've both done the same thing. In Philadelphia, in the Rosenbach Museum, they have all of Bram Stoker's research notes from when he was writing Dracula. And every year at Halloween, I would give a lecture about the writing of Dracula. And how the version of it that we read was not the version he started out to write. He had other ideas. Even some of the elements of it that are now people think are part of actual vampire folklore, he made up to save himself from a big mistake. In the early part of Dracula, you guys have read Dracula, right? The early part of Dracula, it shows that Dracula's really kick-ass powerful. And then he gets to England, and if they didn't do something to limit his power, it'd be a very short book, kind of a pamphlet, because he'd just kill everyone. So Stoker came up with and it's in his notes where basically he's saying, oops, where he created this idea that Dracula can't enter a house unless invited. So now you have a much longer book because it takes longer for him to kill people. But and that's part of the fun of being a writer is, we borrow things from real life and then we expand upon them. There's so much stuff from vampire folklore and werewolf folklore that is different from what we see in Hollywood movies, and it's fun to play with that. I also, when I'm writing stories like Kagan, I like taking some of the things that people expect and change them rather than build them. He doesn't use swords; he uses knives. That's something. As a martial arts guy, I've been doing martial arts for 58 years. Even though I studied, the Japanese kenjutsu, Japanese swordplay, and I've been doing that for 55 years. If I was going to get into a fight, I would prefer a short knife, something that does not slow your hand down. Sword does. So, Joe Ledger's a knife fighter and a short range fighter. Kagan's a short range fighter. Gee, I wonder where that comes from. Come over there.
This is from Cinnamon. How much do you cackle when you drop those little teasers from Ledger and Pine Deep? I love them.
Quite a bit. And in fact, there's one tiny crossover with the Ledger universe and Kagan. One character is going to show up in Son of the Poison Rose, not Mr. Church. Just say he's a character that's caused Joe some trouble in the past and is not entirely human and is immortal. So he'll be fun to do. You guys can probably figure out who that is. His eyes change color, really weird. That guy. He's a trickster spirit, so they're immortal. So he's going to show up. Known as the Prince of Games in Poison Rose, but he does name check the name from the Ledger books.
I think the people in the virtual chat are coming up with it.
Yes, probably. It's not that difficult and I've kind of mentioned it a few times anyway. People keep expecting me to put Mr. Church in there. The Kagan universe is set 50,000 years from now. Everything from our civilization is gone, except for some bits and pieces of relics trapped in glacial ice. We will find out more about that in the third. Well, there's some in the second book, more in the third. But our world has been forgotten by them. The only things that remain are things like the legends of the fairy folk and so on, because they're immortal. So they're coming back. The different types of fairy folk that are mentioned in the books are out of Celtic folklore. And, I'm Scottish, so I feel that that's not only my right, but my obligation, represent. But yeah, I love little teasers, and I do have some fun with it. There are a lot of little Easter eggs thrown into some of the Joe Ledger books. The new Joe Ledger book coming out in August actually is a sequel to one of my favorites, but in a weird way. And it's one of those it has a plot line to it. The main plot line, is a new story, but there's a subplot that's a sequel to Code Zero, and somebody leaked online what the title of the next book is, which kind of spoils what that is, but it's already online. So it's next book is called after K13. The book after that is called Burn to Shine. And if you remember Code Zero, you'll wonder, how's he doing that? Because that character is supposed to be dead. That character was a zombie, harder to kill than you might think. So anyway, what else we got? Maybe it's yeah. Oh, Deadlands. Yeah, that was based on a role-playing game called Deadlands, and I did a book called Ghostwalkers. They had done comic books and short stories before him, but the creator of the game, Shane Hensley, had reached out. He and Jeff Marriott had reached out and said, "Hey, would you be interested in writing a novel based on the board game?" And I'm like, "Well, yes, but I've never played the game. In fact, I'm not a game guy. My level of video games are like gin rummy, words with friends. That's about it. I'm not a game guy. My son was. So they sent me tons and tons of background material, and I went up writing the book, and I had a great time with it. I don't own the characters, though. I wrote them under license for that. Weirdly, I was going to do an anthology of Deadland stories, but there was a licensing thing, hitch, that made me have to change it to just a regular Weird West anthology, which I'm still doing. And now the Deadlands anthology is back in play again. So when that comes out, there will be another story with those characters in it. And that's fun. The next two books in that series were written by one by Jeff Marriott and one by Shauna McGuire, and they did fantastic jobs with it too. But I liked Gray Torrance and Thomas Looks Away. They were fun characters, but I don't own them. And that's, I created them, but don't own them. And that's one of the things in an aspect of my job, which is media tie-in writing books set in other people's worlds. I was telling these guys before we started that, in the new Black Panther film, there are characters I created while I was writing the Black Panther comic in 2009 and 10 that are in the movie. The Midnight Angels, the character Anika, Shuri as the Black Panther, that was my run, and Shuri fighting Namor was in my run in 2010. But they're not my characters. I wrote them while I was writing for Marvel, and it's fun to do. But there are some characters you kind of wish you could take with you. Oh well. Yeah.
Dennis Crosby asks, congratulations again on the release, brother. Curious to know if you've thought about creating a graphic novel featuring Kagan. Not that you don't have enough to do, of course.
Actually, I would love to do a graphic novel of Kagan, and it's something I just somebody had reached out to me recently about possibly doing a Joe Ledger comic book. And if that goes through, the next thing I pitch to that group is going to be the Kagan comic. But it wouldn't be an adaptation of the books. I want to do new adventures of Kagan, kind of like I did with the Conan comic book, where they adapted a couple of the short stories, but they didn't really do an adaptation of the Conan stories. They just told more stories of Conan. That I would like to do. So, any other questions, topics, thoughts? Yeah. Well, two things about that. One, there is no such thing as writer's block. People believe in it, but it's not real. I'll explain that. Writer's block is a label that has been slapped onto a whole bunch of different things that can stall a writer in place. And even though that individual writer may not know the solution and therefore feel blocked, there are always workarounds. Every single problem that exists for writers, there's a workaround for, and usually multiple workarounds. So the trick is and it's one of the reasons we have the Writers Coffee House here every month and have them in different places around the country, because that's a question people could ask. I can't seem to solve this problem. And then you're going to have people at the table, 4 or 5 different answers on how to solve it. And, when we write a book, we're the god of the universe of the book, but it does not mean we have omniscient knowledge about how to write. We learn constantly as we write. So there are things that I would not have been able to figure out. Things that I did in Kagan, I would not have been able to figure out 15 years ago, because I wasn't the kind of writer back then that I am now. I learned by each book. I mean, the book I just finished, Cave 13, The New Joe Ledger, is my 47th novel since 2006. If I wasn't paying attention, I shouldn't be in this field. And if I wasn't paying attention, I wouldn't have gotten faster and better, because my first novel took me 3.5 years to write, 18 revisions. You learn as you go along. But as far as burnout goes, that's a funny thing, because I get asked it a lot. And there are times, like last year, I had COVID twice, I had pneumonia, all during book deadlines. Second time I had COVID, I had to finish the Joe Ledger book. I wrote a 165,000 word Joe Ledger book with COVID in a little over 2 months. Sometimes doing, 10,000 words a day. When I was finished that book, my brain was empty. I spent a lot of time sprawled on the couch watching television, not remembering much of what I watched. But then the brain fills back up again. Burnout happens, I think, more often when you're not as much in love with writing as some people are. I have a buddy, Kevin J. Anderson, one of the really top writers in the biz. He's writing the Dune novels now and done tons of stuff. It's 182 novels now. He is a professional. In fact, he runs the Superstars Writers Conference in Colorado Springs, which is just the business side of writing. And one of the things that we talk about is, what's about burnout. And if you're burning out on something, go write something else. Go write a short story. Do something else. Do research for a week and fill your brain with all the stuff you want to put in a book. There are things you can do to prevent burnout. Because people don't always know the solutions for things, that makes them feel like they're burned out, because it's really what it is really frustration. Frustration because you don't have the answer. But talk to other writers, ask that question, read about writing, and the solutions come. Now, all that said, there are some writers who do not like the fast lane. I have a buddy, Dennis DeFoya, great writer, written like 3 or 4 novels in the 15 years I've known him, but that's the speed he likes. And Ridley Scott just picked up one of his books for a TV series. So it's not like if you're not writing a lot of stuff, you're not going to get anywhere either. Harper Lee did basically one book and then one book that her sister revised and put out that we are going to pretend doesn't exist. But if you really love it, and I love writing, I have more ideas than I will live long enough to write. My agent has sold the next 8 books that I have yet to write. And I've given her information on another 8 or 9 that she can sell. And she's like, when you come up for air, we'll talk about selling them. But, we can't sell it. You're going to write 8 books in 2.5 years already. Let's just worry about it. Maybe in a year from now, we'll start talking about the other books. But that's the thing. Sometimes when you fall in love with writing this much, you can't imagine yourself going through a day without writing. My wife and I went on vacation to Aruba some years ago, and my plan was I was not going to do any writing, none at all. And I had about 2.5 days of that. And then I start sneaking my notebook down to the pool. So, I'd be sitting there making notes. And she's like, "Are you writing?" Just had an idea I'm writing down. There's like 9 pages of stuff I've already written. It's why would I want to not have fun? Because it is fun. And also, I like even the challenging parts of writing. I like the editing. I'm about to, when somebody gives me edit notes, I actually like getting the notes. I'm not precious about my stuff. I don't fight the editor on it. I may disagree sometimes, but it's not going to be a fight because it's part of the job, and I love this job. I've worked other crappy jobs. I've had some really awful jobs. I was a bouncer in a strip club for a while. That was the worst job for anyone with any kind of soul, because by the time you're done doing that, you just want to kill every human being out there. Awful job. Plus, you're fighting every night, and that doesn't make you feel good. So writing is a lot better than that. Nobody tries to stab me. Nobody tries to take. I used to be a bodyguard. I got shot at, got chopped in the shoulder with a meat cleaver. Nobody does that anymore. Worst they get now is a paper cut. I'm okay. I'm good with that. Yeah.
Tony asks, would you consider putting Joe Ledger and the team in a Delta Green story? Delta Green is an RPG and novel about secret government organizations fighting Lovecraftian monsters. Sounds fun.
Yeah, I borrow other people's characters from my books, so I would be happy to do that. And speaking of which, by the way, I actually had writer friends of mine ask me to put their characters in my books. Joe Lansdale asked me to put Hap and Leonard in a book. So in Relentless, the most recent Joe Ledger book, Hap and Leonard are in there. My buddy F. Paul Wilson asked me if I wanted to use Repairman Jack. I'm like, yeah, I do. So he's in the next book. I've had some of Larry Correa's characters show up in my Ledger books, and I've actually written a Monster Hunter International story. James Rollins, who's a good buddy of mine, suggested that I use a name check Sigma Force in some of the books, which I've done. Same with Jeremy Robinson and Weston Oakes. And that's fun, too, because it makes it, for the readers who read a lot of this stuff, they start seeing it's all in the same world. and that becomes fun, because there are times, plenty of times, we'll be sitting around over dinner or something, and we'll talk about how our characters, each characters would handle a situation, and so we even think about it as all the same world. So yeah, something like that would be fun. So, some of the subtleties of personality. And I'm going to go back to Jacob Ravensmere. I mean, his character, there's a scene in the first Kagan book where he's talking to, first he's been interviewed by Lady Kestrel and Lord Netsbar about being the historian for the Hakian Empire, and then he's in front of the Witch King explaining what he would do and what it would take to buy him, body and soul. Now that, there is a level of subtlety in that scene and moral and intellectual complexity that I kind of grew into. I mean, I like my first few books, quite a bit, but I can see as I became a more practiced writer that my insight into subtlety of character development evolved as I wrote. The more I write, the more I can handle characters. Also, I don't know that I would have made Kagan as much of a. I don't think I would have done as much damage to him in the beginning of the book as I did had I written it 10 years ago. I think I would have had him more of a stalwart hero, but PTSD is something that's actually a big factor. I mean, I taught women's self-defense for 35 years, so I'm used to seeing students of mine, coming to class with various kinds of trauma and damage from it. I was an abused kid, so I have my own. But also, the last couple of years, I saw what was going on with my brother. My brother was a Vietnam vet, a couple of years in Nam, horrible years in Nam. And PTSD just was his enemy his whole life. And I wanted to explore a little bit of that PTSD with Kagan. Unfortunately, beginning of last year, my brother committed suicide. So I also got to see how deep that is. And as a result, I wound up writing a short story, which was in an anthology recently, about a writer whose brother comes to see him to kind of, they haven't spoken in a long time and they're talking, and it was really based on my brother and I. And it turns out his brother, it's his brother's ghost. And I would not have been able to, I don't think I would have had the courage to write it 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But after my brother's death, I spent a lot of time in my own head thinking about the relationship we had, 10 years apart. We grew apart and we never really resolved that before his suicide. And as difficult as that is, the writer in me wants to explore it, needed to explore it, and to write it. I became a little more free with taking real world trauma of various kinds, mine and other people's, and digging deeply into it, because I have a confidence built based on my having written so much. I know that what I can do with language, with plot, and with character now. So, a good question. Sorry, I swallowed the wrong way on my last sip. Now when I cough about something, we're getting. Yeah, another one.
All right, so he's going to avoid spoilers, but will we learn more about the true nature of Father R and Mother Saw from Christopher?
Not really. They're not as important as the people of the Silver Empire thought. And in fact, it's an example of a made-up religion to a degree. I mean, they did manifest. Kagan saw them manifest in the beginning of Kagan the Damned, where they said to turn their backs on them, and that's not a spoiler because this fourth chapter or something like that of like 150 chapters. So, it's really early. But they're really not that important in terms of the overall cosmology. If things go well and I do another series of Kagan books, which I already have in mind, I'll be exploring that religion quite deeply, because it'll be the. I can't even say that because that would be a spoiler. I'll just say that I would have the opportunity to explore that a little more deeply in a slightly different setting than this. But that religion was born in a short story I wrote called The Damned 100. My very first epic fantasy short story, and set in the same world, but 1,100 years before Kagan the Dam. And I just like the idea of a harvest religion. I think that's kind of a cool religion. And there are harvest religions all around the world. A lot of indigenous peoples have variations in harvest religions, and I've read a lot about that. I've spent 6 weeks on the Navajo reservation, and harvest and everything related to it is incredibly crucial to them. And when growing up in the city, I grew up in Philadelphia. I mean, I don't even know if I saw anything that was green and alive when I was a kid, So meeting people who, like with the Navajo, every day they would start the day off by throwing pollen into the air and blessing the air, because the pollen would hopefully land somewhere that would bring crops that would feed the people. The belief in that, the simple and yet incredibly subtle and complex belief in that, was so profound that it made a big impression on me. But it's just that religion is less important in this series of books than it would be if I do another series of Kagan books. And because I have the idea of what I want to do to explore that, its origins and its growth beyond the end of the Silver Empire.
Does anyone have one last good question to end the event with?
Fred? Rising paper costs, rising oil prices, and supply chain is what did that. Though I am going to be exploring doing a limited sign-numbered hardcover edition of the second and third book, and my publisher's fine with that too. But the oil prices really slammed the book industry, and a lot of places have been switching from hardcover to trade paperback. And also, I have sold many more trade paperbacks than hardcovers. The Joe Ledger series, it just seems to be the zone in which I sell the most books, and that matters to my publisher. Any format it shows up in is okay with me. I mean, cuneiform, smoke signals, I don't care. But the publisher was looking to cut costs, and I think it was 122 of us were told that our next book in a series would be in trade paperback. It's like, oh, well, okay. Some things that are going on with Barnes & Noble had something to do with that too. And we won't talk more about Barnes & Noble here at an independent bookstore. Yep. Actually, British publishing has been a much more efficient method of publishing for years and years. And we're starting to pay. We're actually learning from British publishing, just like the streaming services we have now with shows being 10 episodes long. England's been doing that for 25 years successfully, allowing bigger actors to be in a 10 episode show and then going off to make movies the rest of the time. And we're now learning that from them. We should not be this far behind the curve. So.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Let's have our virtual and in-person. Everyone, clap your hands. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream now and begin the in-person signing. Thank you so much, everyone, for asking such wonderful questions. I hope you have a good night. Bye.
Bye.